Okay, I think we can go ahead, and since we have our attendees joining in, I would like to use this time for newcomers to our Agri-Food Connect webinar series and talk about really briefly about Kök Projekt and Agri-Food Connect, and then we can start diving in to our next edition. Today we have Caesaré and Renske with us, and we're going to talk about the US agri-food ecosystem and its insights, the startups, the adaptations, and the new normal in the US agri-food sector. So before we begin, my name is Semi Hakim. For those of you doesn't know me, I'm the co-founder and the CEO of Kök Projekt. We are an accelerator and a corporate innovation partner for the agri-food sector. We work together with companies, governmental organizations, and NGOs time to time on developing acceleration programs that will support entrepreneurs to reach their potential and beyond. We are based in Istanbul, Turkey, but we are quite active within MENA, FSU, APAC, and also the SSA region. So we focus on emerging markets, and we work together with our local partners on developing acceleration programs that will empower the agri-food entrepreneurship. We cover all of the steps of the food value chain. We work together with the startups within all of these 5 sections of food and agri-food sector. And we develop these programs in collaboration with the organizations I just mentioned and create them platforms to grow and expand. So to find out more about our work, our programs, and our reports, you can log in to our website, which is kökprojekt.com. In there, you can find several other stuff that we do. One of them, which is we prepare reports on the topics of agri-food innovation as a snapshot to understand what's going on in the sector, what are the new developments, and who are those startups who are affecting the sector. Also in there, you can find our maps that features so far the Turkish agriculture ecosystem. We've shared our first map just recently 2 weeks ago, where you can find the startups and also the players within the system. Next, you can also log into our join to our newsletter, where you can find out all of the developments, news, and basically the startups within the agri-food sector. And lastly, you can join into our digital community, which we call it Kök Community. In there, you can meet with startups, sector representatives, and also the academicians who are part in the agri-food sector. All of this you can find out in our website in kökprojekt.com. So this is the map I just mentioned. So you can find it in detail on our website. This is, I would say, a living organism we are developing as we go. This is the second version of it, and we will be sharing our food ecosystem map next month as well. So today, our topic is Agri-Food Connect. And Agri-Food Connect is our webinar series that we kicked it off a couple of months ago. And the idea of it came with, with the new normal, the agri-food sector is changing. Way we produce food, way we deliver food, way we consume food is changing, and it's changing everywhere. So we wanted to start off a global conversation around food with the key players in each ecosystem to share their insights, their examples, their stories on what's happening in the agri-food sector. So you can find out about our first sessions as we did with our partners in Europe, in MENA, and the FSU on our YouTube channel. And today we are kicking it off, the Agri-Food Connect US edition. And on our first event, on our first session, we have Renske Lynde. She is the general partner of the First Course Capital, and also Caesaré Assad. She is the CEO of the Food System 6. So Caesaré, Renske, thank you so much for joining in today. Thank you so much for your time. I was really looking forward to this session. And I would like to pass the mic to you to share your organization, your work, and your insights on the agri-food sector. So thank you so much for joining in.
Thank you so much, Semi. Let me go ahead and do the share screen so we can get into this. How are we looking here? Look good?
Good.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone from Sonoma County, California. It's a pleasure to share a little bit of time with you all. I'm Caesaré Assad, the CEO of Food System 6, and we are a nonprofit based in the Bay Area in California. And let me just, there we go. We are really focused on supporting entrepreneurs from all over the world. Much of our focus has been on supporting entrepreneurs who are focused on the US food system. We've really been expanding that work quite a bit. We do our work through running formal accelerator program. We also partner and run other types of programs. And all of the work is really focused on founder first support for CEOs who are building with a focus on impact. We also do a lot of work to educate investors and others with and opportunities to engage in the food system. So thank you very much for allowing us to fulfill a part of our mission here today. I'm just going to provide a brief overview, a little bit about our work, set some context, and talk about some of the companies we're working with, and then pass it over to Renske, and that way we can kind of hear from the audience a little bit more. For us at FS6, as a nonprofit especially, we have the ability to have an explicit focus on impact. So that means we are really looking at entrepreneurs who have, purpose built into their soul and spirit, which is really the definition of entrepreneurship. But we're looking for companies who are focused on impacting healthy people, sustainable ecosystems, vibrant farms, who have a focus on justice and fairness in their solution, and then who are building solutions with circularity, regeneration in mind. I've listed out some of the innovation segments that we work within, but I think more interesting to talk about some of the companies. I saw Mehmet over on the chat, so what's up, Mehmet? One of our Turkish companies actually in our portfolio. But so, this is our portfolio currently. We have 35 companies that we are working with. We launched our first cohort in 2016. And, the work we do is really long-term. So many of the companies that you're seeing here, we're still actively working with and supporting. That's really the ethos behind what we do, is that we're focused on sort of removing barriers, and we're focused on building a systems-based cohort and portfolio so that we can really learn from the diversity of solutions. I think this is just a great example of, we're working with ranchers, farmers, to folks that are building, blockchain solutions. So there's a lot that we can talk about, and by intention and by design, we look for a systems-based approach so that we can talk about and sort of understand really the complexities that entrepreneurs are facing, and then help communicate those out more broadly. So our current cohort, very exciting and very, at least on topic for what we're dealing with, specifically relating to the pandemic here in the US. We're dealing with these issues of racial justice that have plagued our country. So there's a lot going on in terms of the landscape. We actually selected these 6 companies back in December. And what's been interesting for us is that all 6 of these companies are currently seeing increasing demand for their products, for their services. These companies are all ramping up. And the reason that that is happening is because they have resilience really built into their business model. So back to those impact areas, all 6 of these companies are addressing healthy people. I think a good example is Firebrand Bakery. They're a bakery based in Oakland. This is an example of someone who's been able to really build a baking business into a community cornerstone. He's finished raising a Series A so that he can expand during this, which I don't know a lot of entrepreneurs closing Series A's right now. So it's a pretty significant move. And for Matt, of course, he's sourcing high quality regenerative grain and flours and ingredients, but he's most importantly building a regenerative workforce. And so the majority of his employees are formerly incarcerated, formerly homeless, and he's really been able to create a model that's generating community wealth, community ownership, and also contributing back to the local value chain around food production. The last kind of piece, and I'll happily get into any of those, companies, but the last piece I'll just mention is that, we are focused sort of on regional food systems here in the US, and that's a big part of, what I think I can lend to talking about in terms of the ecosystem here. And because we're, like to keep this really broad lens and perspective as well, we have a partnership with HUHTAMAKI, who's a global packaging company out of Finland. And they are supporting us with running a current circular economy startup program. So we're also working together to look at today, right now, what are the solutions, both from packaging, all the way through to other types of circular and regenerative solutions that we can look at from a global perspective to help move us towards a more sustainable food system. So happy to dig into any questions there. But with that, that's my intro, and I'll pass it over to Renske.
Awesome.
Thank you, Caesaré. So hello, everybody. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. And another shout out to Mehmet. It's good to see you on the chat. So I'm Renske Lynde. I am both a co-founder of Food System 6 and currently serve as board president, as well as general partner with First Course Capital. So we are an early stage venture fund investing in, as you see here, exceptional entrepreneurs who are transforming the US food system. Very excited to be here with you all today and happy to share a bit more about our investment strategy, as well as some of our portfolio companies and how they are reacting to some of the shifts we're experiencing in the market right now. So again, I think that this is a story that is best told through the portfolio companies and the investments that we have made. But we are, an institutional capital investor, and typically will end up being one of the first institutional capitals at the table in a startup's financing life cycle. We also have a partnership with Food System 6, and we are investing in all eligible accelerator graduates, as well as donating a percentage of our carried interest to support the ongoing work of the nonprofit. These are some of the areas that we are interested in, and you probably won't be surprised to see that they map quite well onto the areas of interest of Food System 6 in terms of where we see really innovative and impactful innovation happening in the ecosystem. And so these are just some of the big areas that we are interested in and looking for startups who are developing solutions. Next slide. This is our current portfolio, and there's more information, of course, available on our website, which is 1cc.vc, where you can find out a little bit more about our investment strategy and, again, the themes that we're interested in. These are 5 of our companies, our current portfolio companies, who are developing solutions all across the value chain. So both from on-farm and on-ranch through the commodity trading platform that we're invested in, as well as through B2B solutions that are digitizing and streamlining some of the efficiencies in our food system, as well as, of course, some consumer packaged goods that are developing really, interesting, innovative, and importantly, sustainably sourced and clean ingredients. So in terms of what's happening in our ecosystem here in the US, and of course, we're happy to dive into more of these details in the questions, but as you see here, and as we are experiencing, consumers are, I would say, not just still seeking purpose and action-driven brands, but in fact, it's growing. The demand for these products and services is growing. As Caesaré mentioned, the entrepreneurs and the businesses that are delivering, really transparent solutions to the market, and ones that are really, their purpose is clear in terms of the value proposition that they're delivering to consumers. We're certainly seeing still continuing growth in that sector. Next slide. This is a trend that we have certainly been working towards for a very long time, and something that we have seen gain significant traction in terms of the recognition that you know, companies have much greater purpose than beyond serving their shareholders. And so the need for companies to be delivering a social and environmental impact along with their solution has become increasingly important. There was a series of reports actually that Mintel produced on predicting consumer trends into 2030. And, you know, no surprise to those of us that have been working in this space for a long time, but you know, it's clear that, as they say, successful companies will be those that improve the health of the planet and its population. So, you know, this continues to reinforce our belief that, you know, companies that are delivering a social and environmental impact are the ones that ultimately are going to succeed in the long haul. And then, of course, you know, as Caesaré indicated, much of what we have been seeing in, you know, the last stretch of time in terms of the momentum that the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests around racial inequity and justice in our, both in just in our society as well as in our food system, are increasingly coming under scrutiny, increased scrutiny, and consumers and citizens alike are demanding some, you know, different solutions to some of these big challenges. Next slide. So, you know, in terms of what entrepreneurs are going through at the moment, as Caesaré indicated, you know, it's quite a feat for entrepreneurs to be closing rounds right now. So investment activity, of course, did decline and slow down early in the year when the pandemic first hit. But we are starting to see an uptick in terms of what's happening on the investment landscape. So this is some data from a report recently released by Next, which New Hope Network. So it's one of the natural product industry leaders here in the US. And we are still seeing consumers, as I mentioned, you know, really still looking for, and in fact, you know, increasing their search around functional products and, you know, things that are food that can help them boost their immunity, obviously, as people are, you know, increasingly concerned about their health. Next slide. So, of course, we are experiencing, as you know, many other regions in the world, some significant supply chain shifts in terms of what is happening in our channels and how food is making it or not making it to people's plates. And of course, we're starting to see some pretty significant drivers that, again, you know, these are trends that had already started in terms of online and e-commerce. But, you know, when study recently released by Bain and Company estimated that the US online grocery spend increased from about 3 to 4% to 10 to 15%. So, you know, obviously developing omni-channel strategies and identifying ways to, you know, better reach consumers is clearly something that entrepreneurs and startups need to be thinking about in terms of guaranteeing their success in this current climate as well as beyond. And, you know, again, this is obviously also creating some, you know, disruptive new opportunities in the market. So next slide. Next slide. And one of those I'm happy to talk a little bit more about in terms of an example of one of our portfolio companies. So, you know, as food service has obviously, you know, shut down and, you know, since reopened and now is again on, you know, a bit of a shutdown here in the US, that's creating some, you know, significant disruptions in terms of how, you know, producers and companies are getting into the market. And this has, next slide. This has resulted in an incredible amount of innovation. So I think, you know, as we always like to say, you know, we think that farmers and ranchers and producers are the original innovators and the ones who have really been thinking and have had to think in very entrepreneurial ways in terms of how they're reaching their customers. So these are just two, you know, recent Washington Post headlines that are talking about how farmers and ranchers are having to pivot and iterate their business models in order to, you know, reach consumers in this time. And so one example, this is a portfolio company here of ours at First Course Capital. So Blue Cart is a B2B solution that connects suppliers and vendors to food service. So obviously in the time of COVID has had to, you know, make some necessary pivots. And of course, the way that, you know, entrepreneurs do that, the best way is to listen to their customers. And in this case, in the case of Blue Cart, their customers are wholesale suppliers and vendors who were not able to sell into into food service, and also were not positioned to connect direct consumers. So Blue Cart developed functionality in order for those wholesale vendors to actually do that and connect direct to consumer. They also developed functionality in part due to a grant that they received from a national nonprofit organization here dedicated to mitigating food waste, to help connect suppliers and vendors to food banks, which are providing emergency food assistance here in the US. So, again, I think that's a great example of entrepreneurial thinking and, really reacting and responding to a rapidly changing marketplace, but ultimately really listening to what is it the customers need. Next slide. I think that's it. I think we're ready to open it up to questions and look forward to the conversation.
Excellent presentation. Thank you so much. I wanted to actually start off with one of the classical questions I always ask to our guest speakers is that how would you define the US ecosystem for startups? I know that a lot of startups would always wanted to reach the US market, expand in there, test out their products and services, but we're talking about agri-food sector as well. So what kind of opportunities and chances do have startups in the US market if they're coming from abroad, and how would you define the US ecosystem for in general for the agri-food sector, of course?
Well, I'll start and then pass it over to Renske. So I think, in general, it's been, I'd say it's quite a saturated market. So it's a difficult market to enter. I think from what I've seen in terms of, really interesting innovations coming from outside of the US, it's really this understanding of some of the unique aspects of infrastructure that help to kind of connect, regional infrastructures around, especially for farmers. So I think that there's a lot of creative thinking and innovations that are built for a, potentially shorter supply chain, a more values connected supply chain. And so, solutions that look at infrastructure and have an understanding of how regionalized food system infrastructure can operate, I think, and understand that from a farmer's perspective, are better positioned than a lot of companies that we talk with are looking to meet farmers, are looking to connect with directly with growers. I would say we've reached a point by which farmers are totally saturated and can no longer sort of be the pilot customer. What's happening is actually farmers are starting to build their own groups of cooperatives so that they can actually work with startups in a more efficient way, so that they can monetize their own intellectual capital and that relationship. So I think that's actually one of the shifts that's happening as there is starting to be so much more sort of innovation for farmers, that there is starting to be this opportunity to look really directly at what are my unique value proposition, what's my unique value proposition and relationship directly to people who are farming and producing food. That's where the innovations tend to have a more direct application based on where things are today, in a just very continuously changing system where there's tons of demand and not a lot of space for growers to think beyond just day-to-day production.
Renske?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I'll add to that, we, as we've indicated, and as I think most people who are paying attention to the sector understand, we are in the midst of a pretty transformative shift in the landscape in the food system here in the US. And, we can talk a little bit about some of the drivers of that, obviously, but, what we have is we have a very bifurcated system here in the US. We have, a system that is highly industrialized, highly concentrated, that is producing, commodity crops, corn and soy being, the primary among them. And then, as Caesaré was indicating, we have, a specialty crop and a small scale production system that is more regional in nature. So again, just in terms of thinking about the farming side and the agricultural production side of this landscape, solutions that are designed to fit either of those paradigms, I think it's really interesting to think about, what are the capacities that can serve both of those production systems, because we are in the midst of this transition and shift away from that style of production to a more regionalized style. So, not all solutions are going to fit. Obviously, there's no one size fits all solution, but, we are starting to see some pretty interesting innovations that, for example, are able to better evaluate soil health and, the sort of composition of soil. Those are ones that actually can function in different production paradigms. And then on the consumer package side of the equation, I certainly would echo Caesaré's perspective that it is quite saturated at the moment. And so, it takes a lot of really innovative and creative approaches to how you are building a consumer packaged good these days in order to succeed in a very competitive marketplace. So those are just a few additional thoughts.
Excellent. So basically, you have to be quite innovative and quite, ambitious and competitive to be succeeded in the US ecosystem on the agri-food sector. But it's quite interesting to hear also the cooperatives are actually taking the initiative and creating platforms for work together with the startups. It's quite interesting to maybe also, seeing that on the future on this side as well, on Europe or on the, Turkey and MENA as well. I think it's an excellent model. But I wanted to move in, since we talk a lot about, the shifting and changing, consumption habits and consumer habits. If there's any examples you would like to talk about, since we're, living in a new normal now with the agri-food sector, changing production, changing consumption and delivery, logistics, and everything is coming to a new, new reality. So is there any of the examples or startups or even, the company activities that you would like to talk about as an example of an adaptation that is based in the US ecosystem? Renske, Caesaré. So I mean, you pick and choose. I will just.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many. I can touch on, I think, maybe just a larger body of work that 3 of our entrepreneurs are focused on, which is humane scale animal supply. So, the headlines with the failing industrial meat supply have been, just everywhere. The labor conditions are horrid. We're really seeing industrialized meat production sort of hopefully reach the point where we realize that we have to create more fragmented infrastructure and to be resilient. So we currently are working with 3 different companies here in the US. One is a rancher based in Kansas. One is sort of an aggregator of humanely produced protein out in California, and then Rebel Meats is a company out in Oregon. And each of these 3 entrepreneurs are basically getting, animals who are raised humanely, butchered humanely, and packaged in a sustainable way to consumers. So nutrient-rich foods produced within ecological balance, and looking to and ensuring that these animals are producing soil health outcomes in their production practices. All of these entrepreneurs have really both figured out they have to work together. So they're working sort of building their own companies. They're kind of all facing the same issues, which is that by and large, the infrastructure from transport all the way through to the consumer distribution has been sort of corporatized to the degree that it's so large and linear that they're working to break those systems apart so that they're more fragmented and more accessible to smaller companies. So I think it's interesting just to see that, we have 3 ranchers working together in one cohort, They're all building different sized businesses from, 10 million down to 1 million. But the impacts that they're having in those individual markets, the ways in which they're able to sort of take this much more intentional design into how are they thinking about their labor, how are they thinking about, as they're looking at taking on investment, how are they thinking about the equity for their employees, really addressing the issues that are coming up today from the failing larger scale production models. They're really taking from learning and adapting those, and they're doing it together. So I think that's what, the collaboration that's happening between the various smaller companies, recognizing that together they can actually take a larger share of the market.
Renske?
Yeah, I can add to that in terms of a very similar and analogous experience that is happening in the distribution part of our value chain. So again, much of our system has been so concentrated and so corporatized, and what that creates is a high degree of opacity in terms of understanding any of the signals that are moving through the marketplace. So, as just one example, in the food, natural products industry specifically, there are very large distributors that are moving product that are, being produced and packaged and then getting into retail stores. And the brands have absolutely no visibility and no connection to the customer in terms of, how are they reacting? How are they responding? How is product moving? So, the interests are quite concentrated there, and there is a need, and we're starting to see some really interesting and disruptive businesses that are coming to really democratize access to information that can work on behalf of these smaller brands, these emerging brands, who are, as we've said and indicated, developing products that consumers really want, but the odds are not stacked in their favor. So we're starting to see some really interesting efforts that, again, really parallel what Caesaré said in terms of the production side and high welfare animal protein development. And again, I would say also just the importance of considering multifaceted solutions. So one of our portfolio companies is Co-Inspect, and they have both a hardware and a software solution that was designed to help streamline food safety compliance. So this is a very archaic, very paper-driven part of our food industry, and they've developed a digital solution to help support, just more streamlined food safety compliance approaches and processes. But again, in listening to their customers, they also recognize that a big issue that their food service operators were facing was temperature regulation. And so, this is, again, it's sort of shocking when you realize just how antiquated some of the infrastructure is in our food system, and again, designed to meet very specific ends, and certainly not as focused on fresh food, which, is fresh fruits and vegetables, which are more perishable, and there's increased demand. So really thinking about what are the opportunities there to also, meet a need as far as temperature regulation is concerned that has both, a cost impact on the businesses in terms of lost inventory, as well as a really significant climate change impact. When you look at, refrigeration emissions and the cold chain that, is not designed, incredibly well, it's still largely, a dumb system that really needs an upgrade. And so I think, being positioned as a startup to, develop a very practical solution that has, multiple, objectives and, impact orientation, I think is also something that, entrepreneurs need to be thinking about.
Excellent. So one of the key takes in this conversation, I would definitely, have it in my mind, is that, future of food, future of agriculture is definitely shorter value chain and shorter supply. And we're talking about a lot of, regional aspect of food production, which is something is definitely becoming part of the conversation all across the world with the, the logistic crisis, closing borders and, changing import and export systems. One of which we also experienced here. I'm pretty sure the same thing happening in there. A lot of countries as well. And that brings also the conversation of how would you sustain, the food sovereignty within the cities and within the, metropolitan areas or even, more crowded regions. And one of the key topics on that is always, comes up with, indoor farming, urban food production, and also creating a different food value chain. So, coming to that, how do you see the shift on the, the urban production, or also, shortening the food value chain in US? Where's the interest? How's the trends, and how would you define it? Caesaré, do you want to go?
Yeah, yes, I have one thing that I think is interesting, we've been talking to folks, policymakers, like engaging with a lot of different, similar to you all, just pretty much talking to anyone. What's interesting and what's happening especially is like New York, for instance, has really recognized, I think cities, especially during this crisis, have recognized like food sovereignty, and being able to really feed our people efficiently is critical need. And so there are so many opportunities now that are kind of, I would say, most urban areas. I know New York is just a great example of one, because they're so far ahead right now of really trying to tackle this issue with multi-stakeholder groups, and entrepreneurs and innovators are an absolute critical part of those conversations. And I think there's part of sort of the work that we're looking into that are these adjacent solutions that are sort of value additive. And some of that is what we're looking at is open source technology. So open source hardware and software solutions that sort of enable and empower, other innovation to happen. We're working with one of our entrepreneurs. He's an entrepreneur in residence for us. So he's basically building autonomous robotic solutions that are open source, directly working with farmers. He's doing that while developing the solution for his business in a pre-competitive environment. So basically unlocking value, creating opportunities for collaboration to happen in a space that helps to unlock and create additional adjacent solutions. And I think it's that sort of that thinking, along with another company of ours, Farm Generations Co-op. They're a 501c12 farmer-owned cooperative software solution. In the US, there are 134 co-ops that are farmer-owned that are 100 years old. So thinking about these alternative ownership models, in addition to how do we make tech literacy accessible in the first place for, farmers, food distributors, food workers, but then how do we actually start to unlock what has traditionally been sort of locked up, the data, the various sort of off-the-shelf components that can be developed into unique solutions. This is all the kind of creativity and I would say the community spirit of giving, sharing, and building together that FS6 focuses on, in that we can kind of bring people in a pre-competitive environment to develop innovative solutions that are focused on how do we build sovereignty now based on what we're looking at today. And yes, how do we connect fragmented systems so that they can interplay together and continue unlocking more value for the businesses and entrepreneurs who are sort of contributing towards the development of a more connected food system. That's a like high level, into it, but I think Renske might have some more specifics.
Please.
Yeah. And just to add on to that, as we think about this shift and this transition to more regionalized systems, we're also recognizing that our infrastructure has been effectively gutted for that type of production system and that type of model. So, much of the infrastructure that we have built here in the United States to support our food system is one that is, large scale, industrialized, commoditized. So, and there are innumerable headlines that have been pointing to, the lack of resiliency, the lack of redundancy in that style of infrastructure development. It has obviously served, very specific ends and point objectives, but we have recognized the failures of that system, in living color. And so is also a need to be thinking about how we invest in, process infrastructure and infrastructure that is really designed to help support the needs of those more regional production systems. One of the other aspects of this that, I think is also really interesting to look at is, where is food being, grown and produced here in the United States for export? So, for example, California's Central Valley, exports a vast majority of the world's fresh produce, and that is a community that experiences some of the highest rates of food insecurity and poverty. And so I think really looking at, where are those contradictions in the system can also help inform where, innovation can and should happen. Because in a region that is so fertile and produces so much food, they really shouldn't have, the statistics that we see in that area. So, I think we're seeing an incredible amount of activity, for example, in the grain industry. So in the specialty grain industry, again, our infrastructure is not well designed to support, a really diverse and, more variable grain product reaching market. Again, it's all been, designed for very specific end points. And so I think there's, some really interesting activity also happening in that area, as well as, of course, in animal agriculture, as Caesaré indicated.
Excellent. I wanted to ask one of these classic questions I always ask within these webinars. How do you see the role of policymakers, the governmental organizations within the agri-food sector? Because when we talk about finance or other sections of entrepreneurship ecosystem, it's always a how do you say, a special relationship with the other startups. But when we talk about agri-food sector, it's highly integrated with what's happening in the whole sector, and how we're going to feed ourselves, and etc. So how do you see the relationship between the startups, corporates, and also the whole ecosystem with the policymakers? Renske, Caesaré, Renske.
Sure. It's one of my favorite topics. I actually have a master's degree in public policy and have worked on policy in food and agriculture for decades. So there is no question that we have some significant work to do on certainly the federal policy level here in the United States. That is not new. This is decades old in terms of advocating for changes to our federal farm bill that are more conducive to, more supportive of, a more sustainable production system, certainly more regional production models. So we actually are, and of course that's been a challenge. That's not new. But I think there's also some incredible activity happening at the state and local level. So as we talked about earlier, just the ability for policy and the regulatory environment to be, not just as it typically is a lagging indicator of change, where, the government actually finally catches up, quote unquote, to changes in the marketplace, but are actually incentivizing and really driving, the kinds of innovation that we think is, really critical in terms of the health of our people and the health of our planet. So there are, a number of really interesting initiatives that are happening at the state and local level to that end. Caesaré can probably talk, more specifically about some of those, but there is a real need, and I think there is often a disconnect in terms of startups who are developing solutions as far as their understanding of how regulated this marketplace actually is, and a real need. And this is something that we've spent a lot of time thinking about and working on it at Food System 6, and now we continue that work at First Course Capital in helping entrepreneurs understand how to navigate that landscape, because it is incredibly complex and very nuanced. So yes, so policy reform at all levels, and again, at this point, the state and local are really leading the way, at least in certain geographies in the U.S., to help drive the creation of really innovative solutions. So Caesaré, add in some color.
Yeah, I mean, I think just the one piece I'll add is that I think in terms of what is really interesting to us are the entrepreneurs who are actually kind of developing policy frameworks that can really be leveraged and built into policy. So we're seeing entrepreneurs just tackle the issues of, who's representing my local government? How can I help with representation that understands the challenges of sustainable farmers? How can we start to basically shift local leadership and get folks into these positions who are helping make decisions collaboratively alongside us, especially as we're talking about infrastructure? There has to be a real hard focus on driving policy in the local communities, because getting things like, a manufacturing plant, getting the access to the real estate to do the development, to implement any of these kinds of solutions really requires, policymakers, and requires a set of collaborative decision makers at the table. And so this is part of the kind of complexity behind the systems side of thinking, is that really understanding in the US that, we've got, the US is massive. You've got the federal farm bill, we've got the policies that dictate federal. And then on the state level, it's like a small country within, each state is really unique. Each state is culturally so different. And we can kind of break that into regions as well. But there's sort of unique opportunities specifically within each of our areas. And as Renske said, some of the local governments are getting really innovative and are starting to look at ways to incentivize and drive innovation in a different way. But this is all, I think, a really critical point and place for entrepreneurs to be looking, because local economies are going to be driving local resources and looking for the people who can actually take and implement these solutions in their local communities.
I think that the three keywords that I would see it as a key takes in this conversation is definitely local, innovative, and competitive. It's definitely the main theme of our conversation today. So to move to our last question, I wanted to ask your thoughts and your perspective on what is the three main topics that you would suggest to startups to work on and develop products or services, or simply create solutions within on the agri-food sector, especially focused on US. Renske, Caesaré, who wants to go first?
I'll go first, so Renske could close us out. And I want to just say, I think you said competitive, and I just want to say collaborative. I actually think that, what I would say is entrepreneurs who are really looking at how do I work with other entrepreneurs, how do we work together to solve these solutions, that is a huge advantage. The more willing you are to share, engage, and really interact and collaborate with not just other entrepreneurs, but investors of all stripes and types, I think that's really important. And I'll say that, Renske said, what are the contradictions in the system? I think that's a great lead into kind of these three areas. It's really around justice. So justice and fairness is a focus area, looking at alternative ownership models, looking at the way that we are creating wealth for the people who benefit from the solutions that we're creating. And some of that looks at, for us, infrastructure. So how are we thinking about infrastructure in general as it relates to all aspects of the food production process and manufacturing and distribution? And then also looking at the, I would say, the regeneration and circularity, the closed loop of any of the things that we are developing. How are we developing those in a way that looks at a true value chain and a true value loop? So justice and fairness, alternative ownership models, looking at infrastructure, and really trying to take into account the complexity of how we're going to collaborate together to make these pieces work.
definitely. Renske?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with what Caesaré just shared. And so I think the only element that I would add is, I think one of the biggest challenges that our sector has faced in the last, decade or so, maybe the last 6 or 7 years, more specifically, is that there are solutions that are looking for problems, and there are people who are developing solutions that they think are needed, without actually having the benefit of really being a part of and connecting with the community that those solutions are intended to solve for. So I think those 3 areas that Caesaré indicated are absolutely the ones that are consistent with where, we certainly see the food system headed and the types of investments that we want to make. But it is really critical to not just be, developing a solution for the sake of developing a solution. I think it's really important. Obviously, entrepreneurship and building businesses is incredibly difficult work, and really having a clear sense of, the experience of a problem, and why an entrepreneur is best suited to deliver a solution into the market as a result of that experience, I think is really important. And it really does kind of upend some of what I would say has been more of the conventional approach to the sector, which is to say, well, this is an enormous market, $3 trillion global market. And as we know, it's fragmented and, is in need of disruption. So let's go, find a solution that can work. I think that's actually not an advisable approach. I think it really has to come from, a direct experience that an entrepreneur has in one aspect, in one way or another, in terms of, their lived experience and connection, again, to the community that, they're trying to bring a solution to.
I think that's one of the best answers we've seen in the whole series. Absolutely, I definitely agree, and I think one of the I would say the silver linings in this situation that we have with the global pandemic is that in each level of governments, companies, NGOs, consumers, producers, everyone is actually quite becoming aware of what kind of food systems we are living in, what are the dangers that we might face with the climate change, changing production systems, etc., and the effects to the environment and effects to our lives directly or indirectly. And I think this last 3 or 4 months has shown that it's actually in a critical stage. It was already in there, and with the pandemic, we realized we have to do something really quick and really effective. And I keep hearing the same questions within the conversations, is that everything is changing, but for the food systems, it could be for the good, because in a way that we realize that we need to do something, and now everybody's taking the initiative to do so, with the startups, companies, governments, etc. So I think it's quite exciting to see that as well. But that 3 main topics is just perfect. Thank you so much for sharing that. I wanted to move in if we have any questions from the attendees. I haven't, but before we finish, I actually wanted to ask one question to you, Caesaré. When I was looking to your bio, I've seen that you were actually a chef before. I was, curious, because I used to be a chef as well, and I would like to, if you like to share, of course, but how would you do that, the shift from the kitchen to the food entrepreneurship? Because I always hear the same question. I was really curious about your answer as well.
Yeah, it's thank you. It's I think the shift is interesting. I still think of myself as running a kitchen, basically. So, probably you can hear a little bit in my response, like I totally think like an operator, and, my experience is just kind of getting the stuff beat out of me, running restaurants, building restaurants, working in food service for years and years. And, for me, honestly, having started my career as a dishwasher and now being the CEO of a global accelerator, like I have that perspective, and it's why so much of sort of the focus of FS6 is around infrastructure. It's around supporting people who are actually doing the hard work behind the scenes to get food to folks. I think that, I actually talk to, and I love talking to food service professionals. And I think especially now, I spent a lot of my career developing culinary job skill training and building these programs that now we're seeing the need to shift. I think food service folks, cooks, people who work in the industry are some of the most creative, hardworking, like incredible people. And, you know, making the shift is about looking at where, you know, your skill sets are some of the most important. And anybody who's worked in a kitchen knows you could pretty much do anything. So I actually think that cooks, there's a real call to action for cooks to step up and bring that passion for feeding people, bring the ingenuity, and look at where, you know, there's entrepreneurs that have complementary solutions and are trying to build, who can really benefit from your expertise and understanding of how stuff works and how stuff gets built, and like actually what it takes to do that.
Excellent. I wanted to ask that before we finish. Would you like to add any last comments that regarding, you know, the work of Food System 6 or the also the First Course Capital, how the people can, you know, follow up with your work, how they can reach out, or how is there any, you know, a new program I've seen regarding the circular economy models as well? Is there any, you know, the last comments you would like to share? Renske, you want to go ahead?
Sure. So I don't necessarily have anything else to add other than, you know, sharing again my thanks for the opportunity to connect and to share what, you know, we see happening in the U.S. food system. For anybody interested in learning more about First Course Capital or, you know, getting in touch with us, we are at 1cc.vc, and there's a way to, you know, learn more about our work and reach out to connect with us. Thank you.
Pleasure, of course. Caesaré, is there anything you would like to add as well?
Yeah, I mean, I just appreciate everyone tuning in. We're always happy to share what we're learning. That's really what FS6 is here for. We have the Circular Economy Program. Applications close August 15th. And I did see a question come in from Sarah about some of the food system infrastructure and financing. Big body of work that we're digging into around blended capital. So we can be reached at fs6@foodsystem6.org, going through our website. We're very, very responsive, the three of us, running around like maniacs, keeping the kitchen stocked. But yeah, we'd love to just engage, and please encourage folks to just reach out to us.
Amazing. Thank you so much for your time this morning. We started way early as well, and thank you so much for, you know, joining in and sharing your really valuable insight and experience and your thoughts on the agri-food sector in the US. Thank you so much for your time. For those of you joining us today and also watching in the YouTube, you can also rewatch this or watch it, this session on our YouTube channel. You can log into Kök Projekt on YouTube, and you can also find out other sessions that we've done. And for the other stuff that we do, as I mentioned at the beginning of our session, you can log into the kökprojekt.com and you can find out our reports and other activities that we do and our programs as well. So Caesaré, Renske, thank you so much for joining in. It was absolute pleasure, and absolutely it was really insightful, and it was a great learning experience for me as well. Thank you so much, and see you next time. So thank you so much for everyone joining in as well, and have an awesome day and awesome evening for everyone. So take care.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.